Hello everyone and welcome back. So we now have a session that is going to unpick some of the themes that we've been developing already, looking specifically at the decade of education for sustainable development and what's come as a consequence of that. And I'm delighted to be joined by Isabella and Barry, who we're going to go through these issues with. So to get the ball rolling, can I just focus in on Sustainable Development Goal 4, explicitly on education, and it says that its aim is to ensure that all learners acquire the knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development. So, what progress do you think has been made in this goal? Can I start with you, Isabella?
Well, I think overall the awareness of sustainability has really been increased a lot, but I think on the point of implementation, it's really lacking. Sustainability isn't present in most curriculums and in most schools, and when it is added, it's almost like an add-on, an asterisk, a note at the end, rather than really being the core of what is important in education and in life. So I think there's a lot of progress that we need to make, and I think where it has been implemented well is usually in the private sector, where the majority are alienated from the benefits.
Okay, so you've started up an organisation to try to unite eco-groups in schools across Scotland. What prompted that?
Well, I did my dissertation research on high school environmentalists and how they source and accept environmental information. And what I found was even those who are the most engaged in the topic really struggle to locate reliable sources, and they face a lot of challenges to being informed and to having the agency to act. So I thought we should make a way to connect groups together and just make that easier for young people, because they're such a powerful force, and if they could really be channeled into one action, then we can make a lot of difference. Yeah.
We're going to unpick that an awful lot more later on, and I'm really fascinated to hear more about the experience you've had in connecting with these different groups and what support is that they feel they need. But Barry, can I come to you to answer that question? SDG 4, where are we with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you look at the numbers, and this is one of my points I'm quite keen to make, in some ways, in a Scottish context, you know, I think there's a lot of things that you can point at and say the numbers are great, there's a huge demand. I think I would temper that by probably maybe something you're touching on, Isabella, which is, you know, well, what is going on and where is it? So is it part of the curriculum, or is it still an add-on or an extracurricular, whatever phrase we want to use? Is it front and centre in the school as part of the generic offer, or is it something that you do if you go to geography and you pick it up there? So I think for us who run the Eco Schools programme in Scotland, you know, I can tell you how many schools have taken part, and I'm really proud of all that. And just recently during the Scottish Climate Week, you know, we had huge online demand. We had over 40,000 young people receiving classes from us. Fantastic demand. But I don't think we would be so naive to say that, you know, all of it's covered. And I would, you know, the kind of questions that I'm interested in as chief executive who runs that programme is who's getting it? You know, what is the equity of that offer, and, you know, are all young people being exposed to it? And if you really, really push me, I think the forthcoming curriculum review in Scotland is a fantastic opportunity for us to reposition climate change, sustainable education, and perhaps in a completely different way, bearing in mind, you know, the challenges that we're facing, and that we're all gathered here to talk about for 2 weeks.
Yeah, and you've been in post for just over a year, and in that time, obviously, we've had to deal with COVID and the pandemic. So, are you seeing kind of major obstacles around that and trying to promote the work that you're doing?
I think it's actually been a fantastic opportunity for us to pivot and support schools in a completely different way than we did before. And there's been a huge, what I actually saw back in June 2020, if we can all remember that far back, was a huge appetite for CPD from teachers. So when we put out an online offer through for a very specific platform in Scotland called eSchool, supported by the Western Isles, or driven by the Western Isles, that allowed us to deliver online classrooms right across the country. But what I was really delighted by was actually the demand from teachers for CPD. I suspect at that time it was a sense we're going to be delivering a lot more outside in a blended learning because of the pandemic. But actually I think beyond that, I think people were taking an opportunity to consider CPD and thinking about what they could gather and acquire during the pandemic, and that was really heartening.
So in my head, I'm trying to stitch together the timeline of youth activism, in that we had 2005 to 2014 was designated as the decade of education for sustainable development by the UN, so around the world. lots of different national programs going on within that. But then in 2018, everything suddenly kicks off and we have the climate strikes and pupils around the world. I mean, a globally connected movement led by young people. So how did this rise to prominence? Where did that come from? Isabella, if I can start with you.
Well, I think it really came from the fact that, along with the rest of us, young people just becoming more and more aware of the severity of the climate crisis and realizing how immediate it was, and at the same time faced with the reality that everyone around them, society at large, governments, the people they trust to have their future at heart, were just indifferent, and there just wasn't the right kind of action. And I think that's really, really frustrating for young people, and it creates a lot of anger and tension, especially when you're trying to imagine your future, and the things that are in your future, the backdrop of your future is all these climate predictions, all these scenarios of disaster, and you can't imagine a time in your 20s or your 30s that you're going to be able to create that stability. And so I think you're pressured to act, you're desperate, you need to do something. Like Greta and Vanessa, they're not happy to be there, they're not like positive and chirpy about youth activism, they're really upset. And I think although it's good to praise youth activism, and it is a positive thing in a way, we have to remember it comes from a place of pain and stress, really, and it's really important that we get on the side of young people and be out there with them, support them, rather than just to praise their pain.
Absolutely. Barry?
Yeah, I think this issue of frustration is really front and centre, isn't it? And I wonder whether, lots of young people are incredibly aware, they're well educated in the subject, but the kind of glacial pace of change around them, I think, is probably about a lot of the frustration too. So I worry a bit about, through an education program like Eco Schools, you can talk to young people about all things that need to happen. But also, if their lived reality is quite different, if the ability to even consider, talking to parents about, recycling is hard because they live in a high-rise block. There's a disconnect between the ambition and the utopia, if you like, that we're discussing in education that needs to happen, but fundamentally doesn't reflect the lives in which people live. And I'm sure that's quite a global issue, and it'll be different in different countries. But the scale of what needs to happen points to quite a revolution in how we heat our homes and how we travel about. But I think for young people, the pace of that is not matching the need. And I wonder, it's certainly not up to me to put, try to interpret thoughts of young people. I'm beyond that now. But I think that's important. The pace of how it's working compared to the frustration, I think, is a massive mismatch.
And I think the direction in which education points the finger is often misplaced. Like, we put a lot of pressure on young people to, start a campaign, get rid of plastic bottles, teach your parents about recycling. But actually, we need way more than behavior change. We need system change. And if we aren't teaching children to criticize the systems that have got us in this mess and link them to a direct lack of sustainability in society and in powerful places, then we're misleading them and misdirecting them.
Yeah, I mean, can I just come in there? I mean, I think there's sometimes a mismatch when you go to school and you've had a very good conversation with senior management and people delivering programs, and then you're invited to go for lunch in the school canteen, which I always really like. I quite like institutional food. I think it's great. But it's plastic. There's a mismatch between, because the contract caterer is still delivering it in a cheap way through plastic. So what messages are young people getting in a formal education setting about that's not great, but actually the institution that they're in hasn't been able to make the change? Now that's not blaming that all on the school. Sometimes that's out with the school's control, particularly in the state sector. But there seems to be there's a lack of coherence that needs to appear, I think, for young people to see the change, at least in the institution that they're in 7 hours a day. So I think that's definitely part of it.
Yeah.
So the word disconnect, I think, is an important one that emerges in that discussion, that what we're talking about, what's perhaps being delivered in the classroom, doesn't necessarily match up to practical realities on a day-to-day basis, and that perhaps undermines the credibility of what we're trying to do. So maybe more a question for you, Isabella, but in your experience thinking about the education you had and then the activism that you've been engaged with, did it come from a frustration at schools? Or did you feel it was actually because you were educated and therefore became aware, and that was the agency that we've been talking about so much?
Well, I think, disappointingly, I didn't really have any education about environmental issues at high school. Even though I've been really into nature, I never thought to pursue a career or involvement in environmental issues, because I was actually completely unaware of the climate crisis until I got to university. I went to study philosophy, but I took a course in environmental sustainability and was instantly shocked and appalled that I didn't know more about it and couldn't think of anything else that I'd like to spend my time doing. And everything I learned in my degree, I just felt should be basic knowledge that everyone should have. We should all start with that base level understanding about environmental systems, about how they function, about how interrelated they are, and about how sensitive they are to our impact. Because from that base, we could do so much. And I think that's why education for sustainability is so important, because, you know, we need that, or we're not going to get anywhere without it. If we want to be ecologically conscious society, then we need to be ecologically educated.
So that's really interesting. You had that moment of sudden shock. It was like a revelation that hit you in obviously quite a terrible way, that there was this crisis. It wasn't something that was gradually fed into your education. Do you think that's a common experience for people in your generation?
Definitely. I think the youth strikes were almost as a direct response to the IPC report that came out in 2018. And I think you are right that kids are educated, but I don't think they're as educated as we think. Some of these climate activists, some of the strongest ones with the loudest voice, they only know that those simple facts, and that's enough to promote them to get out there and start shouting. And we mustn't overestimate the knowledge that these young people have, because they need mentorship and they need guidance. And I think they struggle and they really suffer without that, because they're left in a very aggressive information environment where you can be so easily misled and detracted. And there's so much greenwashing, and we really need to protect kids against that.
It's a great phrase, an aggressive information environment. So we're talking about that later on, but that's a phrase I'm going to remember from this session, and one we can perhaps use the pupils in my school. And Barry, I suppose this presents a strategic problem, if we can call it that, for your organisation. If this is, you know, the mindset and the situation that we're in right now, you know, how do you go about engaging with that and perhaps making sure that that isn't the educational future of the current generation?
Can I answer that by actually agreeing with something that Isabella said? I think it keeps Scotland beautiful. What we want is a carbon literate Scotland. Now, you know, everyone loves a soundbite, but actually within that, just take a moment to think about that. Let's think about relationship education and the journey that we've travelled there, which really needed to be travelled in not just this country, but I'm sure other countries. We've changed the dial on it, and we need that kind of revolution. We need to shift the angle of attack, I think, in sustainable education. So we know that there are schools that will be delivering climate education within geography, but also within science. But actually, I think what we're calling for is to move it to a slightly different place and make it a core part of what the opportunity is. And with my background, which is not always to do with schools, Robin, hope this is okay, it's just also the coherence of beyond schools, that our youth workers and our community workers are also have, you know, the capacity to support young people in having those conversations there. And I think the third thing that I'd just like to add is that opportunity, and I think you just touched on it, Isabella, that we also find the way to, yes, explain the challenge, yes, explain some of the urgency required, but I think we also need to also remember the role that we need to play to paint the positive picture, particularly for young people. Now, the programme that we run in secondary schools called Climate Ready Classrooms absolutely covers the science, absolutely talks about what you can do as an individual. But I think what it's also doing is saying, but there's an incredibly bright future in the change, in this disruption in the economy that really needs to happen if we're going to make the changes. And you'll be part of that. And I think the crucial bit, and I might be controversial in a minute, but the crucial bit for me that everybody sees that it'll be a feature of their working lives. So I'm a wee bit frustrated by the concept of green skills in a way, because I think for some young people it might point towards the outdoors or agriculture or forestry, which are of course incredibly important. But actually, you know, the people who are gas engineers are going to be the people that cause the revolution by changing the way we heat our house. So I think we just need to be cautious in language, particularly at the start of what we're doing, but we're positive to young people about the kind of incredible futures that they can have, not just within engineering, but right across the piece. You know, so anyone is going to be faced with how they support an organisation reach net zero. You know, you can see the billboards all over this city talking about organisations' commitment to net zero. So regardless of the sector they're going to be in, regardless of the role they play, everybody needs to be carbon literate, if nothing else to support the organisation to become net zero by 2045 in Scotland.
So you used the words revolution there, and I think that's a really interesting term because we haven't heard it in our discussion so far today, and I don't see it an awful lot in the discourse around this. Are we in a state of revolution? Has there been a revolution, or do we need to still start that revolution?
We need to still start. We're not there yet at all. I mean, I would really like to see what you were saying, Barry. You need a complete curriculum shift. We need to not teach sustainability as a separate subject, but teach it as an essential part of all subjects. If we could teach every subject through an environmental and sustainability lens, then it would really reflect how important the environment is to us. And I think without that, you're just not giving it the due importance that it needs. And I think learners, when they see that, that's how they treat it.
So that comes on to, I suppose, the real meat of this discussion. What would you like to see happening in schools to bring about this revolution?
I think there's an issue around CPD, teacher training, what that looks like, and I think that goes back to graduate courses. But I think also there's something interesting for me about the sort of middle management training, and I know that will be called different things in different places. But also, in Scotland, of course, there'll be equivalents elsewhere across the world, the kind of get into headship program. What does that look like for sustainability? Is it important? And in a previous role, when the curriculum reform around curriculum for excellence in this country was coming forward, there was a discussion about the importance of partnerships. And when I asked the establishment, if you like, about what does partnership training look like in the get into headship space, I didn't feel that there was an opportunity or much space for that to happen. So, in the spirit of learning, it'd be really great if we really give that some consideration now. So head teachers can lead that change for the specific role they have to play, but empower the middle managers and the senior teachers. But so when teachers coming into the system know that it's going to be an important part. So I don't think we can avoid that. What are we doing around? We're doing a lot around CPD, I think, as I've talked about. But again, I would just remind, we're also building the capacity of other educators and people within communities, because I think that seamless ability beyond the school gates is important, because we shouldn't place the burden entirely on schools. And I think if there's a consistency in learning, both in the informal and formal setting, if that's still a phrase we like, then I think that's really important. I think that can provide that coherence that I think we're probably talking about here, Isabella.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the idea of consistency. I mean, it should really start from as soon as you get into school, and because the environmental issues are so complex, school provides a really good time to go through them slowly and grow in the complexity. As you get older, when you can understand more difficult issues. So if you could start at primary school with basic ecological knowledge, relate it to local environment, relate it to local issues, and then get more into wider global issues, and really make sure that you provide the context of environmental problems, because I think incomplete information can be extremely damaging and be taken in a really negative way. So for example, when I went into high schools talking to students, some of them would tell me that they knew about deforestation, but then when I asked them, okay, so what is the main cause of deforestation, they'd say, oh, poor farmers who need to cut down trees. And that's just not the case when we're talking about like real big, huge deforestation globally.
Yeah.
So it's really important that we make sure that we get the full picture for kids and communicate that effectively. And especially including things like the history of colonialism, Indigenous people's rights, environmental justice. We can't class issues, we can't leave that out for kids because we're misleading them, and they need to be integral to discussion if we want sustainability to be equitable and just.
I'm really fascinated by your own experience here, going from high school pupil through to where you are now and engaging with Eco Clubs Unite. How did you practically go about that, and what were you trying to achieve with it?
With Scottish Eco Clubs Unite?
Yeah.
Practically, it's taken a long time. I think because my dissertation research, I was able to go in and talk to eco clubs and talk to the most passionate environmentalists in high schools. Through that, it just became really obvious that they did not have the support they needed, and they didn't feel part of a collective, larger movement. They felt isolated, angry, frustrated, and there's so much eco-anxiety for these young people.
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing that they should put into sustainability education. There's not enough space for, I know it sounds a bit esoteric, but for emotions and for kids to feel these emotions, because these are very emotional issues. And in psychological research, they talk about that in depth, that it can really cause a lot of depression and anxiety, and they call it eco-paralysis, which means you don't act on those issues. So it's seeing that in young people and just really feeling for them just motivated me and my sister to start the organization and reach out to schools. And when we did, they were so excited about it and really enthusiastic. So we just did our best, tried to get a website developer and just start.
Fantastic. And Charlotte's on a panel coming up next about that activism, so it'll be really interesting to get her take on it. But we've touched on, I think, one of the key issues here, and maybe if we can direct this back to you, Barry, is that how do we go about educating children without inducing that anxiety?
I wonder if I could touch on a kind of quite a specific point, which is, I think, the kind of how we use outdoor learning in a way. And I think, you know, I know I look very young, Robin, but I'm getting on a bit now. And I think if I look back, you know, I was very fortunate. I was brought up in an island community, and I suppose we kind of took that environment for granted in a way. So I know that clouds my thinking. But I was extremely fortunate to have outdoor learning experience that basically immersed me in nature. Now, I wonder how much it's about immersion in nature now, and it's more about, you know, just getting small experiences, or, you know, it's quite protected experiences. You know, you go to an outdoor centre and then go out for short trips. I wonder if whether there's a fantastic opportunity to redefine what outdoor learning can do to young people, because I think they then connect. We're sitting in a room with famously 197 trees, and it's probably making us feel calmer. It's a nice smell, and there's all sorts of things going on. But I still feel outdoor learning, and I have a long history, as you know, Robin, working in that sector. It still feels something that's quite disconnected. It's not integral. There are, of course, great examples of schools that do that brilliantly. I'm not naive about that. But I think your ability to understand nature and the relationships between the flora and fauna, and then it's in more natural environments, then talk about climate change and the impact. You can look and see it. And particularly in this country, you know, we just have such incredible natural assets, and indeed heritage assets, that can connect people to place. If you care about place, and that's a lot of work we're doing in another part of Keep Scotland Beautiful, is a lot of work heritage. If you can link heritage and place to people, then they're much more likely to be involved in doing something about it, clearing it up, tidying it up, but learning about it and wanting to protect it. So I think that, is a really important part of how we can make the shift. And again, moving outdoor learning into something that's not just, you know, something that's done in the end of summer term because it might not rain. You know, there's some fantastic experiences that we can have throughout the year, particularly in our country, and I know many other countries will share very similar incredible natural assets. Well, let's connect young people to them.
And when we've talked about this before, I was really struck by your point about the language we use when we do outdoor education, and how that in itself is sometimes imbued with negativity about the environment.
Yeah, so we were talking about, you know, the kind of experience of conquering mountains and, you know, survive in the outdoors. And I've never felt it that way, you know. I've always felt it was about an experience. And, you know, my background's doing a lot of sailing, and again, we're very blessed in the west coast of Scotland in particular to see not just incredible landscapes, but actually to see sometimes quite fragile communities. And I don't mean in that patronising sense. I mean that, you know, from a sustainable development sense, actually. So, you know, whatever they're doing for their economy is fragile, particularly in something like a pandemic if the tourism or tourists don't go there. So I think you can learn a huge amount from that rather than pretend it's something to conquer. You're already putting up a barrier to what should be a very natural place for learning. And I think it should be, we should just find better ways to do it and use language that doesn't present it as almost like a transaction, you know. So we're going to do something in the outdoors, okay? Or we're going into the outdoors to learn about maths today because that's the most natural thing in the world. So, I mean, again, practically, you know, so some of the work we're doing in eco-schools, as you'll know, Isabella, when we're doing litter picks, it's not just about picking up litter, putting it in a bag and going, great, we collected 9 bags of litter. It's we've gone and collected in the outdoors, and then we're looking at the damage that it does to the local environment. You know, you go that step beyond, and you might do surveys on it and the rest of it. So it happens to be outdoors, but that's not the outcome, if you like. So, but I think you're right. I think, you know, that conversation we had about language is critical, how we reframe it. but make the outdoors a very natural extension of school life and indeed wider education.
And coming back to, if we can spend a bit more time on what schools can be doing, so we really want as many practical takeaways as we can get for teachers who are tuning into this. And Isabella, thinking about the groups that you've connected with and worked with, what's some of the good examples of practice that you'd like to see happening that other people could perhaps follow?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, so in the people that you've spoken with and the eco clubs that you've connected with so far, what are the groundbreaking things that people are perhaps doing or young people are doing that other schools should be thinking, oh, that's a great thing, maybe we can do that too?
Well, I think the groundbreaking stuff is really coming from bottom up. It's really young activists putting their all into getting change made, even against so much inaction and dismissal from people in authority, which is really disheartening. Like, a lot of these activists are facing uphill battles when they're for very basic things like, oh, please could we have some recycling bins, or like maybe we should do something with our food waste. I mean, it's a little bit depressing, to be honest, and I don't blame the teachers at all, because the teachers are under so much pressure, and specifically in Scotland, it's the council who are their employers, so they can't say anything directly against the councils. And so that's why I think it's so important to empower places and spaces where young people can meet up, organise, get the resources they need, and the support from teachers, but ultimately they decide what happens in their school. And I think it's just a wonderful thing to really give a channel for young people to understand how much influence they can have on their society, starting in the place that they have to be in every day, so school.
So, at the risk of straying into controversial territory, because we like doing that, there's a big agenda in Scotland towards pupil voice, promoting pupil voice. We use the word agency a lot. It sounds a little bit to me like what you're saying there is this is just lip service, that actually is that voice really getting through? I
mean, sustainability in general is lip service. Like, it's become a tick box exercise. Everywhere you'll recognize, oh, they've mentioned sustainability, but what does it actually mean? There's no depth to it. And it really dilutes any real sustainability, or what sustainability actually is meant to mean and what we want it to mean and the values of it, rather than just the greenwashing, oh, it's sustainable, but is it really sustainable? I don't trust.
So is education part of that greenwashing phenomenon?
Yeah, well, because education primarily is used to prepare children for work, to be good for the workforce. And the workforce at the moment, the jobs that we have, are not sustainable. So it leads to the conclusion that education is not sustainable as it is.
I was talking about that earlier on, about the idea of education for sustainable development and education as sustainable development, so we still need to make that shift forward. Barry, are there any projects or particular examples that you could point us in the direction of where you think people are doing kind of really good work?
Yeah, could I just pick up the sort of concept of sort of empowerment, because I think it's really interesting. I think, again, a particular experience we've had in this country is young people getting the franchise, they're getting the vote at 16, 17, and I think that has shifted. It might feel slow, but actually it has shifted the relationship really positively between politicians and young people. I'm sure the pace of that doesn't feel, but it is an important moment to capture, that the things that matter to young people absolutely now matter to politicians. So I'll leave that hanging. But I think there is this kind of concept of not empowerment, because again that's from me to you, is the concept of co-design. And we work with fantastic partners, Young Scot and YouthLink Scotland, on COP26 climate ambassadors. And the very heart of that is co-design. And Young Scot as an agency have done a fantastic amount of work in helping lots of different organisations think about what co-design looks like. Not what empowerment looks like, but how you bring young people into the conversation genuinely. And we've seen great examples of that between the police and the National Health Service in Scotland here. Genuinely thinking, trying to bridge the gap of what young people really need and want, and actually what the services that are provided. So I know that that's a feature of some of the discussions that's going on with the current curriculum review, but I think co-design at school level is a really interesting concept, not just school council. I wonder if that's just we could change it and shift it there, because ultimately what it's about is giving away power. And I think as part of that, as leaders, whatever phrase you want to use, is allowing young people to make decisions that you don't like. Now, I don't think that's instinctively something that education likes doing. They want to guide young people to make better decisions. But I think maybe that's where potentially, if I may say so, and to be controversial, where youth work maybe allows that, will allow young people not to make mistakes, because I think we all believe that mistakes is just another form of learning. It's how we guide and allow young people to make decisions, allow them to reflect on it. And I think sometimes that's also about money, and we need to be honest about that, and allow them to, if bins is the issue, that should just be pretty straightforward. But I think we need to be honest about what co-design and what empowerment therefore looks like. It's about money at some point. And I think that's important to just be aware of that when we want to do it.
You triggered something in my head there. I'm an avid reader of Brené Brown and her leadership books, and there's a great phrase that she uses about rumbling with vulnerability and encouraging people to do that. And I think you're right, we probably need to be a bit braver and accept that some of this will be uncomfortable, and as you say, do things that we're maybe not immediately instinctively happy with if we're going to make the kind of changes that we need to see happening. I'm aware that we've got about 8 minutes left, so maybe a good moment to turn to the audience to see if anyone would like to ask any questions.
This is a tough conversation. Not because of your content, but because for 3 years I sat on the open working group to establish what are now the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And I spent a good deal of the time on education. And I will tell you straight out that the education goal didn't come out the way I had hoped. Because midstream, I had a change. First of all, the planetary boundary science came forward. I studied that with Johan Rockström at Stockholm Resilience Center and carry the title of Diplomat of the Biosphere as a result. I also went to Bhutan, where the 6- and 7-year-old children really revealed to me what was missing in education. And that was a real direct link to the environment, to nature, and the sensitivity that even notices when something is off in that relationship. And when I saw that, I said to my team, we need to scrap everything we've written so far, and we need to do an intervention. I invited the director of the school in Bhutan to come on our phone call to help me share the experience of her young learners, who by this time now, the Kingdom of Bhutan had enlisted to teach the rest of Bhutan society about the pillars of gross national happiness. But what these children had is a sensitivity around being disturbed by simple things we had become accustomed to. What I knew is that the complexity that we need to understand and recover has to do with the very simple sense of interrelatedness, interconnectedness, and interdependence with the lived environment, with the earth, to know ourselves as nature. So I'm going to get to a point real quick because I could go in 1,000 directions. I want to give you a laser comment on language. In the English language, we capitalize the word nature. We stopped doing it during the industrial age. Language matters. How we perceive, we are perceivers. The language shapes how we understand our world. And what I did, one simple act, because I'm a part of the UN Harmony with Nature program, was to recover the capitalization of nature in the UN system. We did it through the program, and I first had to go to Oxford to do that. Why? Because the editors at the UN use Oxford. And I made the case in 3 ways. One, I found the history that we did once capitalize nature. 2, Mother Nature was now in the dictionary and capitalized, and so we could use a derivative form of Mother Nature, nature, and use that form. And so this was really important. And so in the Secretary General's report, we do capitalize nature in the reports on harmony with nature. And I think I'm sitting here in the New York Times Climate Hub. They have taken on the foreground on helping us have this conversation and reporting on climate. I would like to see the capitalization of nature so that we can begin to see this change in the way we think about ourselves separate from nature, and we return to that intrinsic, indivisible relationship we have with nature. So we don't have to reach over a lifetime to realize we're connected. And therein we'll find the capacity to have this complexity that we're looking for. We started with a conversation on the global north and global south. And this is the difference in the developmental path in the south versus the north, is that industrialization took us from a connection to nature while they still have it. So this is where more exchange also needs to occur. Informal education says, we know where our water stream is, we know where the watershed is, and we identify with it. The day I walk in America and ask someone where their watershed is and how healthy it is, and they can answer it, I will know we understand again what we are a part of and who we are as humans. So the ontological question now is more important. What does it mean to be a human being?
Yeah, I think that deserves a round of applause, doesn't it? How would you like to respond?
Can I come back and just one point which thank you. And I think this relationship with nature is really interesting, not just because of a connection to trees, flora and fauna, but actually, as you say, shifting our just relationship and our happiness in general. And thanks for framing it that way. I think there's just a point which is quite obvious, but I think it's worth saying that increasingly with the urbanisation, I think that is a global issue for all of us, rather than, and it happens in Scotland for sure. But just a note that the decisions about the environment are probably taken by people who live in urban environments. And that's really important, that the global south, so the south and the north issue is also an urban v rural issue, I think, as well. And we just need to remember that as we go forward, and that certainly resonated with me.
I don't have any extra comment to add, I just agreed with everything.
If I could maybe throw it back to you, if it's okay. So we started this by talking about the decade of education for sustainable development, and then as a history teacher, I'm still trying to get the timeline straight in my head about how we've reached this point. It was fascinating seeing Al Gore speaking on this stage a couple of days ago, and I think back to the impact that An Inconvenient Truth had on me when I saw it. And then we had the decade for education and sustainable development, and then the SDGs coming in, and we have the Incheon Declaration, then we have activism kicking off in 2018. So how far away do you think we are between the very noble aims of SDG 4 and seeing that happening at the micro level, down in classrooms and schools around the planet? Where do you think, how optimistic are you, if you don't mind me asking you that?
I tell my students I'm radically optimistic.
I love that phrase.
Yeah, because just as we are at the edge of tipping points, what I really do feel is that the Earth is, in its own way, calling us back to relationship. When we're in that relationship, and I don't say this just glibly, there are cultures around the world that still have relationship, and because of that relationship, they're experiencing the world and the rebalancing going on in the world very differently than we are. My Maori counterparts see and are walking in this time, understanding what's going on with the mother, and they're with her, you see. So they have a very different way of responding, but also they see the human opportunity. And when I sit around in an assembly of trees, where I am right now, I feel we are going to find our own tipping point where we just wake up and go, oh my goodness, how could we have done what we've been doing? And I do feel we'll see leaps in our action, leaps in what we're really not, we no longer find relevant or tenable in our society. And we know one tipping point was smoking, but I think this next one is the convergence of things that we no longer will put up with. In other words, up with this I will no longer put. will just become really clear. And we're not going to be looking at sustainability. We're going to say, oh my goodness, this blue gem of a dazzling planet is not asking us to survive, it's asking us to thrive. You can't have this much beauty and abundance and only be asked to be living in sustainability, but it does mean that we need to live in harmony. So I believe that is what we're going to wake up to, and the climate feedback system is the very thing that this Earth, that is very much a mother, is bringing us to this next evolutionary leap for our species. Means we must mature, and mothers know how to help children mature. It gets a little rough, but we'll get there.
We are, yeah. Very well said, very well said. I'm so sad that we've run out of time. Well, this could keep on going and going and going, but we are going to introduce youth activism for our next session coming up. So it really are carrying on very much the same themes. Very appropriate, I think, that on November the 5th, you two have been setting off intellectual fireworks today. Thank you so much, Isabella and Barry. A round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.